Hi, I'm Andrew Wallace, and welcome to the We've Got a Problem podcast, where each week we explore inspiring stories of struggle, success, and solutions to prevalent problems, and how our guests have turned a problem into an opportunity. This week I'm joined by Donald James, author of Manners Will Take You Where Brains and Money Won't, Wisdom from Mama, and 35 Years at NASA. In a world that seems to have become even more transactional the last few years, I'm really excited to get a chance to talk about manners. Donald, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, Andrew. I'm happy to be here and excited to have this conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, let's start with, I can't go past it without saying 35 years at NASA.
Yes.
That is quite the career, especially in an age now where people, have an average of 7 careers during their lifetime. How did you spend 35 years at NASA? How did you get into that?
Once I decided I was going to make my career at NASA, which really happened after the Challenger accident in January of 1986, and there's a whole backstory about how I even got into NASA and got to that point, which I wrote about. I guess you could say it's a bit cliche that I really found my calling. In many ways, because I discovered how incredibly passionate many people were about the space program. It seemed to be a great unifier. It didn't matter your politics, your religion, or whatever. People just got excited about it. And I felt that I had something to offer. And I also liked that I could reach a lot of people just because of the kind of badge that I had and where I worked. And so when I made that decision after Challenger, and there was very specific things that happened during that tragedy, I said, I'm going to make a career out of this, which wasn't my original goal.
Challenger specifically, what was it that kind of drew you into to make that switch?
Yeah. So at the time before Challenger, I had started with the agency at the Goddard Space Center, and pretty much my plan was to get enough work experience to go off and do what I thought I really wanted to do. And there was more to that, which was I was studying economics and international development, and I was going to solve the problems of the world of economic destitution and poverty. My dad was in the Foreign Service. We traveled around the world a lot. And so I felt that was my calling. Even though I started off as an aerospace engineer, through a cathartic experience, I changed and went into a field that I thought was more aligned to what I wanted to do. So why did I ended up staying with NASA? Getting into NASA was an interesting story, but let's just skip that for now and say, so why did I end up? After Challenger, of course, as you recall, the listeners will recall, there was a teacher on board, Christa McAuliffe, who was one of the astronauts who died. And after that, the head of NASA education, whom I had met, called me and said, several weeks after the tragedy, that the agency, had the mission been successful, they were planning to send Christa and some of the other astronauts around the country. Remember, this was all about inspiring students into STEM and things of that nature. And so he asked me, we plan to still do that, but we're going to do it with the backup astronaut. The backup astronaut to Christa McAuliffe was a woman named Barbara Morgan from Idaho. And so they asked me to be Barbara's public affairs spokesman, her handler, her baggage person, or whatever it is, and go around the country when she gave talks. Sometimes I'd introduce her and things like that. So that's what my job was. I got to know Barbara very well, and she's a delightful person. In Los Angeles, we were at a large convention of teachers, and many of them brought their students. And as typical the case, I would introduce Barbara to the audience, and she would give a talk. After the talk, there would be Q&A. The people wanted to get her autograph, and then my job was to get her out of there to go to our next event. And at this one particular event, I'm standing over to the side of the dais, and Barbara's signing autograph. And this little boy comes up to me, I'd say about 10 or 11, and he has a notepad with a pencil in it, and he's holding it up to me, and he's got this look like, he's concerned look. And I assumed that he was afraid he wasn't going to get a chance to get Barbara Morgan's autograph. And I said, don't worry, go ahead and get in line. I won't pull her away until you can get her autograph. And he looked at me and he said, no, I don't want her autograph. I want your autograph. I said, why? I'm not the astronaut. Why do you want my autograph? And he looked me straight in the eyes, Andrew, and he said, yeah, but you work for NASA, and that is just cool.
There you go.
I'm in.
Yeah, I'm
in.
done. Fine.
I'm in.
Inspiring children. Yeah.
I said, if just by virtue of my employer,
Mm-hmm.
I personally could have that kind of impact on students, then I want to devote my life to doing this. And so, a couple of interesting prologues to this story. I eventually became the head of all of NASA education, just like the man who asked me to do this. And on my first day of the job, the very first person to call me and congratulate me was Barbara Morgan.
There you
So
go.
that's why
Well,
I stayed after Challenger.
well, there you go. So I mean, so you become the head of all education, all these
Yeah.
things. When did you kind of figure out that manners were an important part of helping to further your success?
Yeah. I think I labeled it after I had retired, even though I felt, see, I had been trained by my mother
Mm-hmm.
all along about manners, and I also did a lot of personal development training in NASA. I was a training junkie. I did training in NASA, outside of NASA. So I had a lot of influences. I also read a lot. But in terms of naming it as far
Mm-hmm.
as how it was related to my success, that came when I gave a talk after I retired to a group of NASA interns. When one of them asked me if I could go back in time and tell my younger self, advise him, what to do to be successful, but knowing what I know now, what would I say? And I said, wow, I think I would remind young Donald, pay attention to your manners. It's really going to be the key to your success, not at the expense of competence and not at the
Sure.
expense of ambition. And I always want to emphasize that, because NASA is never going to hire you if you walk into the interview and say, well, I got great manners, that's why you should hire me.
Right.
They're going to laugh you out of the interview room.
Sure.
So it's a given that you have to be competent, you have to know what you're doing. But I felt that an advantage really is how you comport yourself, how you interact with people, the authenticity that you have. And as I describe in the book, manners is just much broader than the notion of politeness, the please and thank you stuff. I mean, those are important. Don't get me wrong. I still say please. I still say thank you. I still handwrite thank you notes to people who gift me, just like my mother taught me. But a lot of it is about how I listen to people,
Mm-hmm.
my body language, the tone of my voice, the words that come out of my mouth, my sense of presence, how
Yes.
I listen. Am I really
Yes.
listening deeply to people? Um,
Well, it's more than manners.
yeah,
Then it actually transcends into respect and touches all those other kinds of things of treating people reasonably and fairly.
yes,
And beyond all that, because when you go in and you're listening to somebody and you're
yeah,
actually, I mean, really authentically listening,
yeah,
paying attention, giving them their due, treating them as an equal on equal footing with you
yeah,
in your attention, giving yours to them and all those things.
yeah.
That is a gift.
It is. And I think even for students who are looking at, like what colleges they're going to go to and
Mm-hmm.
what kind of classes they're going to take, I challenge students to ask themselves, why are you taking AP classes and honors classes? Are you really doing it because you care about the subject, or do you think it's like a box you're going to check? And if you check the right boxes, you're going to get into the best schools. And so to me, when I talk about your manner, I'm also talking about your relationship with that what you do. That's part of your manner, right? It's an attitude. It's where you're coming from. That's often something that you can't describe very easily because it lives inside of you, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like someone's essence, if you will. So, and many times I struggled in the book with trying to describe what that is, because I'm not sure how you train people that way, other than having somebody who is really willing to follow a mentor and a role model who really exhibit those kind of traits.
Well, yeah, I mean that's one of my big questions is
Yeah.
I can fully accept the fact that we don't always focus on manners, especially more broadly as you've defined it.
Yeah.
And then the question becomes, what do we do about that? How
Right.
do we get better? How do we lead lives to our full potential? How do we encourage people and again, just be rock star superhumans here at work and in everything that we do? What is it that, I mean, where do we start? And you say manners are broader than please and thank you. Again, I totally get that.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about how we can do better.
I have a couple chapters in the book. One's called "Who's on Your Team," and the second one following that is how to build your team. And what I mean by that is, my hypothesis is, Andrew, starting with the premise that if you're interested in cultivating your manner skills, first of all, you have to assume that there is something to cultivate and there's more there. And I want to say to you and the listeners, half the reason I wrote this book was for myself. I'm still a work in progress. Anybody who thinks they've made it and they've got it, I would challenge that. And so how do you do that? Well, and this is seen in a lot of the literature in other areas about the importance of having people in your life, not necessarily your friends, but they could be your friends, who you really invite them to work with you and tell you the truth as they see it. And sometimes it gets really difficult, because if you see a situation where you realize why somebody is not getting along, or not necessarily getting along, but somehow there's a block in their growth and development, the problem may be that they talk too much, that they don't listen well, that they seem to be cocky, they're know-it-alls. Well, who's going to tell them that? And then how even if you accept that critique, how do you then decide how you're going to make an adjustment? Because some things are so ingrained in us personality-wise, it may be difficult not to do that.
Right.
Now, I use the talking one a lot because that's my challenge. The only thing that I would share is that I remember my dad many years ago when I was a teenager. The only time I ever remember my father disciplining me once is, apparently I talked too much when we were in a store trying to buy luggage or something. And he took me outside and basically said, you have a big mouth, son, and you talk a lot. And you need to decide when it's appropriate to talk and when it's not appropriate to talk. Something like that. Because my dad was a diplomat and a lawyer, so he always spoke in very diplomatically lawyerly terms. But I never forgot that. And here's the thing. I still talk a lot, but I know better now. And I know how to manage my talking in order to be more engaging with people in a way that is helpful. And for me, my anecdote to my talking a lot is my insatiable curiosity about other people.
Yes.
And I'll just ask them questions about themselves and their interests. And then I don't have to, it's not about, well, you talk and then I'll talk and I'll tell you mine. It's not like your turn, then my turn. I'm just curious for no reason at all, that I'm just trying to understand.
Well, so I mean, one of the things that comes along with that, with the curiosity and learning when to talk and when not to, is the fact that so many people process things by talking, and others process it by thinking it through, ruminating on things. Yeah. And when you find two people who come together, who one processes things externally by talking them through, as in fact, in some ways I do, particularly on this podcast, because I'm learning things as we go along, right. Along with the listeners. Right. So, and of course it is a audio based format, but as well as video, but the fact is, when you put two people together, that one processes things by talking and the other processes things by ruminating, it's very easy for the person who processes by talking to just completely step on top of and tread over that person who's just thinking it through, and never give them a chance to express what they are. I realize I stepped on you a little bit earlier there. Go ahead and finish your thought.
I appreciate the scenario that you painted, Andrew, because what I would suggest is, and I think it was chapter 2, is called Know Thyself. Mm-hmm. If you understand about yourself that you process things by talking out loud. I do that, by the way, and I've actually gotten in trouble with that because I will say things. Often, sometimes I'll speak the counterfactual, just trying to test something, and people think I actually believe that. I says, no, 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 I'm just trying to put it out there for you to beat me up so I can understand why I'm wrong about that hypothesis so I can clarify what I really think,
Right.
I mean, it gets kind of complicated. But the fact that I know that now, what I'll tend to do is that I will tell people, it says, I tend to think out loud a lot, and I want to make sure I understand where you're coming from on this particular topic. So please stop me if you need to make a point, and I'll make an effort to mitigate in my talking so that we can have a common understanding about an issue. Mm-hmm. So it starts with that kind of self-awareness. If I'm not aware that I do that, and the person who ruminates is not aware of how they operate, then that could be for a very difficult interaction. Yes. So a lot of it is about awareness. And where do you get that awareness from? Ask your team, ask your mentors, ask your coaches, invite them to tell you, you know what? You tend to sit back and hang out and ruminate a lot, and you don't seem to get your word in, and you just need to be aware of that if you want to make a contribution, you figure out how to navigate that in a room full of A-type personalities that are going to talk over each other. Okay, well, that's an awareness.
Well, and there's also a familiarity that comes with once you've worked with people a little bit and you kind of have set the table, so to speak, to say, look, I process things by talking and thinking through things. And that's kind of how I go. So if I say something that you'd go, does he really believe that? Is that how he feels? Is that who he is? Probably not. When I'm talking it through and asking questions, because I really legitimately am asking the question. I'm wondering, well, what about that? How are we going to solve that? Are we going to do this? What if people say this and all those things? And you don't assume that I've gone all the way down the road there. So a little bit more, you got a lot from your mother.
Yes.
You said, especially when it came to manners. What would you say the most important lesson is? Just the one that stands out to you that your mother taught you.
Well, my mom, when my brother and I had to clear out her house after she died. She actually died unexpectedly about 2 months after I made that famous talk where the young man asked me the question. So the book was kind of born out of my desire to honor my mother. It was part of how I was processing my own grief about her loss, as well as I wanted a longer answer to that young man's question. And one of the things my brother and I found is that she had this list called Muriel's 8 Cardinal Rules of Life. She didn't source them from other people. But one of them stood out to me. What others think of you is none of your business.
Well, actually, that's something that I wanted to ask you about, because when it comes to manners, I think there's a misconception that people think that we don't need to worry about how we're actually being. We just need to check these boxes, right? Like you kind of said earlier. Because I've known a lot of people who on the surface are polite. Just they follow a set of ground rules that their parents taught them, or this, and here's how you do it. Oh, thank you. And they say this and they do this, and there's just this kind of protocol that people follow, and they just look at it as like the rules, and then they get kind of butthurt when people don't follow that exact rule, but they're not being authentic either. They're just, okay, I got to follow the thing and offer a drink when somebody comes in the house. Can I get you anything? Can I take your coat? Can I do all this stuff? But they're behind their back. They're just they're tearing you apart. But at the same time, and I coming around this a little bit of a circuitous route, but the way that a lot of people come at an absence of manners by saying, I don't care what other people think of me, how they perceive me has nothing to do with it. And I don't need to be liked. I just need to be heard, or I need to be effective, or I need to do all this. And that's the kind of balance. But to say how other people, what was it? How other people see you is none of your business? Say that again.
What others think of you is none of your business.
Yeah.
The challenge is that if you use that as an excuse to say, Well, then I'm just going to show up to the interview with my gold chain and rose-colored glasses and my hat on because that's just how I like to look. And
Right.
what they think of me is none of my business. Well, it also might be that you don't get hired
Right.
because you weren't paying attention to, and I have a whole chapter on interviewing, you weren't paying attention to the dynamics of, the interview process and what that means. And so you have to ask yourself, are you really going to fall on your sword because you believe so strongly in something? And if you do, that's fine, as long as it's authentic.
Right.
To your earlier point about, sort of the pretending of being very polite. I share a story about a young man that I ran into at the airport in Atlanta, Georgia once. I was on a business trip and he greeted me at the door. He was a bellman and he was just so polite and nice and hello, sir, and welcome to the Atlanta Hilton or whatever it was. He went on and on. And so he took my bags and thanked me for coming and have just a wonderful day. And I gave him his tip. As soon as he walked away, I think I said to the lady who was about to help me, she was waiting for our transaction, and I said, I have a feeling he's not like that at home. And I appreciated that he was trying to act mannerly, but because I saw the act, I felt that I wasn't getting him. I want the person, I don't want the actor. And I think you can be genuinely mannerly and the person with being true to yourself. I mean, if you're having a bad day, I mean, you can own up to that, but you could still respond and interact in a respectful manner. But to have, it's almost like he had studied his checklist. Say
Mm-hmm.
this thing, say that thing,
Yes.
say that thing, in order to sound right because that's what I'm paid to do.
Right.
That's not what I'm hoping for through this work. The one of the most liberating things I believe for people to experience is the freedom to be true to thyself about things
Mm-hmm.
and be able to engage with that in a way that is understood and respected, but doesn't necessarily hold them back or cause any problems, externally to people. It's just being truthful in a way while being respectful. I talk about meaning and fulfillment in the sense that the term success is often tied to rank and to salary and making money and all that stuff. And there's a lot of people that people might say, oh, they're successful, Elon Musk and Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and all of that. And typically those standards have to do with, how many zeros are in their bank account or whatever. And I don't believe that that really is the true measure because there are a lot of people who are successful by those standards who are not happy. Some of them have actually taken their lives. Some people are very smart and very intelligent, but they also aren't necessarily happy or they're criminals like Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff wasn't stupid. Bernie Madoff, for those who don't know, was that famous guy who ran a Ponzi scheme and stole billions of dollars from his clients and was sentenced to prison. Was a broken man. He died in prison. He wasn't stupid. He just was a criminal. And so I have a kind of a moral, a virtuous component to manners in the sense that you could be a very polite person who's a killer, right? If you're a
Yeah.
sociopath.
Yes.
And I'm saying that's not right.
Right.
So I want to make that distinction, in terms of your outward presentation and your intention for advancing the human condition, which is frankly what I think all of us would like to be able to do.
Right.
And how do we do that? I mean, there's a lot of ways to do that. So that's what I mean by having meaning. For me, what was meaningful and fulfilling for me was knowing that I played a role in somebody's development at NASA. I don't even remember what my salary was when I stopped working for NASA because at some point it really didn't matter to me anymore.
Right.
Because I had the things I wanted to have and I was able to, pay for my mortgage and do food. And
Right.
I'm not saying that people shouldn't have enough money to do those things. I'm just saying think twice before you think money is your salvation, because I really don't believe that's the case. And
Yeah.
I approach salvation as one word. I like to use the word liberation because it's freeing from the lens of manners, how we view the world and relate to the world, how we view our fellow person. I'm deeply concerned about, hate crimes against, Asian Americans and LGBTQ plus people and other forms of denigration of the other because we are not interested in being curious about them as human beings. And if you can just do that, I think we would be in better shape. And that's a manners matter, how you approach that.
Right. Right. Well, and again, the issue of respect, authenticity, empathy, all those things kind of go together.
Yeah, they
Because
do.
if you are empathizing with the person that sits across the table from you and see them as another human being, it's a lot harder to commit a hate crime against somebody when you look at them as another person.
That's
And
right.
that has kind of been the focus in the past of all these totalitarian regimes trying to start wars and do all these things with anybody, is to make the other people, the people on the other side of the coin, appear as less human. They will look at other people as they're doing something that is an abomination to God, an affront to all of us, and
Right.
and they're not. These are not people. These are
Yeah. And
inhuman.
I think you're absolutely correct, Andrew. And I feel that it's not inconsistent by remembering that we're talking about human beings that perhaps are doing bad things.
Right.
And why isn't our focus on that? See, I make a big distinction between excuses and reasons.
Mm-hmm.
I don't excuse the person who beat up an old Asian woman. There was a case in the news recently where
Yeah.
a man was convicted of that. I mean, it was horrible to see. To me, there's not an excuse for that, and the person needs to be held accountable to the full sense of the law. And I also say there's probably reasons for that, unless he's a
Right.
sociopath, which means mentally they just have no capacity whatsoever.
Right.
But this I know, the reasons may be the more difficult things to address and solve because
Sure.
it's probably rooted in poverty, poor education, awful family life, drugs, and there might be a lot of things that we as a society
More than one thing.
that's
More
right.
than one
More
thing
than
that's
one
probably
thing. It's
behind it.
complicated. And why aren't we focusing our energy on resolving that? And at the same time saying, you're going to be held accountable for your behavior. I appreciate your reasons, and we're going to be held accountable for your behavior, but let's devote some resources into figuring out. I want to prevent people from doing it in the first place. I have 2 children. It doesn't matter to me that they've locked up and put in jail a lot of murderers and rapists, Andrew. The
Right.
fact of the matter is, I don't want the next murder rapist to target my family.
Right.
And
That's it. I mean, hey,
know?
and a lot of it all comes down to personal stuff, what we value, what's important to us,
Right.
and how we engage and interact with the world.
Right.
And hopefully with your book in hand, people will learn to engage and interact with the world in a more positive manner.
I hope
have
so,
a
too.
few questions that I
Yeah.
want to ask you before
Please.
because I try and ask everybody. What would you say the biggest fallacy is that it seems like everybody buys into that just turns out to be total hogwash?
Well, for one thing, manners doesn't mean you have a right to manage your boundaries. If someone's attacking you, Andrew, let's say they accost you on a street and they're berating you and whatever it is, you have the right to protect yourself and your family, maybe
Yeah.
by any means necessary. I would suggest that people look at how they respond to certain things, right?
Yep.
I will tell you this, and this is what I've had to work on a lot. I know your listeners can't see me, but I'm an African American male. I'm 65 years old, so I came of age in the 70s and 80s. For most of my life, it was sort of indoctrinated into me that if somebody called me the N-word, particularly somebody not in my tribe, which is a whole nother conversation about who gets to use that word and who doesn't, that an appropriate response could be physical response. I have
Right.
since changed that because that is not a harm to me physically or to my family. So I can choose how I respond. I can still be hurt, and I do get hurt, and I can still feel resentment, but I am working on a response that says, I don't appreciate the use of that word. I want you to know that as a human being, I do love and care for you. And I hope you can see fit to find a way to communicate with people like me in a different manner. Our conversation is over, and then
Right.
walk away.
Yeah.
So that's hard to do because, what I
Oh,
see a lot is someone says, "Hey, you, what's his name?" And then the first thing that they want to do is hit somebody. That actually happened at NASA between two senior NASA leaders a long time ago. Literally, they got into an altercation in the gym. These are the highest ranking
right.
NASA people, except for they both work for the administrator. And the Caucasian man called the black man the N word. The black man hit the Caucasian man. And it probably doesn't come to surprise to many of your listeners that the person who lost their job was the black man
Right.
because he committed an assault,
Right.
and that's illegal.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's so much to the idea of setting your boundaries and kind of regulating your emotions around these
Yeah.
things and having perspective that's very difficult in highly charged situations.
Yeah.
And that can very quickly, especially certain words, certain language, certain things that, first of all, you go, I hate to imagine what your background would be that you felt it necessary to use those kinds of words. But beyond that, I am not going to necessarily always be able to be in complete control of my response to people who are just plain ignorant
Yeah.
of the effect that they're having.
Yeah.
But it's also important to recognize that I don't have to be perfect. And
You
it's
don't.
not, I am not being disrespectful to respond to somebody in a strong fashion, to a show of strength, not necessarily physically, but to put up a firm boundary when something happens that is
Right.
deliberately targeted to
Right.
to
Yeah.
offend.
We just need to ask ourselves, is it our internal emotion that's talking,
Yep.
or is it or what is it you're really trying to accomplish in that moment?
Yeah.
In that moment, what is it that you're really trying to accomplish?
Kind of the last question is, what's the most underrated concept that people overlook? What are people missing?
Look, I'm obviously biased and prejudiced, but I didn't, painfully go through the process of writing my first and maybe my only book on manners to say that I really would like people to take a look at this notion of our manner and what it means and how it affects us in the world.
Yes.
I mean, just pay attention to conversations next time. You're in a conversation and just ask yourself, well, who's talking the most? And why are they talking? And who wants something? Even you can observe conversations from a distance.
Right.
Just
And what's
notice
underneath that?
and what's underneath all of that, and just see that. That's their manner showing up, right?
Yep.
And so I also, as a personal practice, like to do things, and this is a tip, without necessarily needing to have an attaboy or a thank you back, whatever it is. I'll just give you a simple example. Last weekend, I went to the Pac-12 championship game in Las Vegas with my son. Sadly,
Awesome.
my team lost.
Sorry.
However, yeah, it was pretty bad. But my first time, going to a pro game in so long, and even indoors, it was really great. And I have a practice of doing this. I learned this, I think, a little bit from my dad than more than my mom. But I came across several of the workers in Allegiant Stadium, the security guards, the ticket people. And as we were leaving, I made a point on at least 3 occasions to stop, look at a security guard as they said thank you to me for coming. And I looked at them in the eye and I said, thank you very much for what you're doing to keep us safe. I really appreciate it. And in every case, Andrew, from everybody that I talked to, and I was sincere. I meant what I said, and I looked at him in the eye. I can tell in their face, they're like, oh my God, who says this thing? And so, whether I made their day or not is irrelevant to me. It made my day to know that, I didn't just have to go through the motion of being pissed off because my team lost and we're leaving this stadium and there's a mass of people. I can still find my humanity and look at somebody who is just not another worker, but a human being who has a family, who has children, who has aspirations, who has a job, and trying to make it to say, thank you for doing what you're doing for us. And just do that and be curious about people. I think that's the most underrated, underappreciated skill that we could develop. And I really believe that.
I'm totally there with you. Just to be seen, heard, acknowledged.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Donald, thank you so much for joining me. Folks, if you want to know more about Donald, you can find him on his website at donaldgregoryjames.com and also follow him on Facebook and LinkedIn. Until next time, I'm Andrew Wallace, and we don't have a problem. We've got an opportunity.